My name is Frederick Osei. I am 71 years old, and my son-in-law looked a nurse in the eye and said, "Delay his discharge, I'm too busy for this," whispered, not apologized for, said it like I was a package at the post office that could wait on a shelf until it was convenient for someone to pick up. I sat in that hospital bed for hours after I was cleared to go home. Hours. The ceiling tiles became familiar to me. I counted the water stains on the second one from the left. I listened to the sounds of other people's families arriving, footsteps in the corridor, voices rising with relief, the soft crying of reunions, and I lay there, waiting, with nothing but silence where my family should have been. No calls, no updates, not a single message. My phone screen stayed dark the way a window stays dark when nobody is home. And I started to think, really think, in the way that only sick men alone in hospital rooms think, that maybe they had simply decided to leave me there, that maybe the decision had been made somewhere between the living room couch and the kitchen table, over a meal I wasn't part of, in a conversation I would never be told about, that maybe, to the people I had loved and sacrificed for, I had become a problem to be managed rather than a father to be cherished. But that night late, when the ward had gone quiet and the nurses moved like shadows, someone walked through that door. Someone I did not expect. Someone who took one look at me, heard what had happened and stepped outside into the corridor, made one phone call. And by the time the sun came up the next morning, my phone, the same phone that had been silent for an entire day, had 112 missed calls on it. 112. And not one of them was from someone wishing me well. Before I tell you what that phone call started, what it unraveled, and why my son-in-law went from ignoring me to calling me like a desperate man drowning in water he had brought on himself, I want you to do something for me, like this video. Subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. Because what I am about to tell you is a story about family, about betrayal, about what happens when people mistake a quiet man's patience for permanent weakness. Stay with me, because this is going to take every word I have what that person said on that one phone call, and the reason my son-in-law's entire composed, arrogant world cracked like dry clay in the rain by morning, is something I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count. There are moments in your life that divide everything into before and after. That night was mine, and I need you to understand everything that came before it, so that when we reach that moment, you feel the full weight of it the way I did. So let me go back. Let me start at the beginning, because betrayal only makes sense when you understand what I gave. My name is Frederick Osei. I say it again because I want you to know me before you judge anyone in this story. I spent 34 years as a civil engineer. I built things, bridges, roads, drainage systems, infrastructure that outlasted the politics that funded them. I got up before sunrise for 3 decades. I wore the same watch for 20 years because I believed a man should be faithful to things that serve him well. I was not a flashy man. I was not a loud man. I was a man who believed that if you did your work with integrity, if you loved your family with consistency, if you showed up, not just when it was convenient, but when it was hard, then life would reflect that back to you. I was wrong about that last part, or at least I was wrong about who would reflect it. My wife, Abina, God rest her, she passed 8 years ago. Breast cancer, the kind that moves fast and takes everything. We had 29 years together, and I will tell you without embarrassment that she was the better half of every good thing I ever did. She was the warmth in the house. I was the structure. Together, we made something that held. Our daughter, Adwoa, was the thing we were most proud of. Not because she was perfect, nobody's child is perfect, but because she was kind. She was genuinely, naturally kind in a way that you don't teach a child. You just thank God when you see it growing in them. She hugged people when they were sad. She remembered birthdays. She called me every Sunday without fail from the time she left for university until she was 32 years old. Every Sunday for 14 years. I want you to hold that number, because there came a time when those calls stopped and the silence where they used to be was louder than any argument. When Adwoa met Kofi Mensah, I tried to be fair. I tried to see what she saw. He was presentable, educated, employed in logistics management, drove a decent car. He spoke well at the dinner table. He called me sir the first 3 times we met, which I appreciated. He seemed on the surface to be the kind of man who understood that respect for a woman's father was not optional. I gave him the benefit of my goodwill, freely, without condition. I paid for half the wedding. This is important. I want you to know this. Not because I want credit, but because later, much later, When Kofi acted as though my presence in his life was an imposition, I would remember that I stood at the altar and watched my daughter marry a man I helped put a ring on her finger, and I had done it gladly. With a full heart, I helped them with the deposit on their house. When Adwoa was on maternity leave and money was tight, I transferred funds without being asked. When their car needed replacing and the timing was wrong, I made it work. I did these things not to accumulate debt, not to hold leverage over anyone. I did them because they were my family, and because that is what I understood family to mean. That is the man who ended up in that hospital bed. A man who had given everything and expected nothing in return except the basic human dignity of not being left behind. The change in Kofi did not happen all at once. I want to be precise about this because I think it matters. It was not a single event. It was an erosion, the way a riverbank doesn't collapse in a moment but retreats, grain by grain, until one morning you look and the landscape is unrecognizable. The first year of the marriage he was fine, attentive, present. He joined us for Sunday meals when Adwoa invited him. He asked about my work. He listened when I talked, or at least, he performed listening convincingly enough that I did not question it. The second year, there were small things. He started finishing his food faster, looking at his phone during conversations. He stopped calling me sir and moved to Frederick without asking whether that was welcome. Small thing. I told myself it was familiarity, not disrespect. I let it go. By the third year, Adwoa and I were still speaking every Sunday, but the calls were shorter. And sometimes I could hear him in the background, not saying anything wrong, just present in a way that made her slightly different, slightly less easy. Like she was aware of being observed, I noticed. I said nothing, because what was I going to say? That I had a feeling, that the air between us felt different. You can't build a case out of feelings, and I was not the kind of man who created problems where none had been proven. But then came the year my health started failing. I was diagnosed with a heart condition, not the kind that kills you quickly and cleanly, but the kind that inconveniences your life in complicated, expensive ways. Medication, dietary restrictions, periodic monitoring, reduced activity. I, who had walked 5 kilometers every morning for 20 years, was now being told to rest, to be careful, to call someone if I felt certain things, to call someone. That phrase alone should tell you everything about how a man's world shrinks when his body begins to betray him. I had spent my whole life being the person others called. Now I was supposed to be the person who called. And the people I was supposed to call were my daughter and her husband. I moved into the guest room of their home at Adwoa's insistence. She was worried. She wanted me close. She said, and I believed her when she said it, that she wanted to take care of me the way I had taken care of her. Kofi said nothing when this arrangement was made. He smiled. He shook my hand. He said, "Of course, Frederick, this is your home too." He said it looking directly at me, and I genuinely thought that he meant it. I should have paid more attention to what his eyes were doing while his mouth was speaking. The first few weeks were fine. Then the household began to tighten around me in ways that were hard to name. Meals were served at times that didn't quite align with my medication schedule. And when I mentioned this, the adjustment was made once and then quietly forgotten. The television in the living room was always on the programs Kofi preferred, and when I tried to watch the news at the time I'd watched it my entire adult life, there was always a reason it wasn't possible. Small reasons, reasonable-sounding reasons, but always reasons. He began to speak about me in the third person when I was in the room, not to insult me, to diminish me, to make me a topic of discussion rather than a participant in it. He needs to rest more. His doctor said he shouldn't. He's been a bit confused lately. That last one, confused, he used it once when I disagreed with something he'd said about money, and I felt something cold move through me because I understood exactly what that word was being set up to do. Adwoa, my kind, Sunday-calling daughter, she was changing too, not cruelly, not with any visible malice. But she had developed the habit of agreeing with Kofi in my presence and saying nothing when he redrew the lines of my dignity. She would look at me sometimes with something in her eyes that I could not name at first, and then one evening I recognized it. It was an apology. She was apologizing with her eyes for things she was unwilling to address with her voice. That is a particular kind of cowardice that can only come from love. From someone who loves two people and has chosen, for reasons of peace or fear or something else entirely, to let one of them bear the cost. I bore it, not happily, but I bore it, because she was my daughter. Because Abina was gone and Adwoa was all I had left of the family we'd made together. Because I was 71 and tired and my heart was not as strong as it used to be. and I did not have the energy to be at war inside my own daughter's home, so I was quiet. I was polite. I swallowed things that should have been said. I watched Kofi's small cruelties accumulate like debt on a ledger I wasn't supposed to know existed, and I waited, without knowing I was waiting, for the thing that would finally make the ledger public. It was a Tuesday when my chest began to feel wrong. Not pain exactly, more like pressure, like something sitting on me that shouldn't be there. I knew my condition well enough by then to know that this was not something to sit with. I told Adwoa. She drove me to the hospital. I remember the drive, the morning traffic, the way she held my hand at a red light without saying anything, the familiar way her profile looked the same as it had when she was 7 years old, and I drove her to school for the first time. I was admitted. Tests, monitoring, the kind of medical attention that is simultaneously reassuring and terrifying because it confirms that something is genuinely wrong. It turned out to be a significant cardiac event. Not the worst possible outcome, but serious. They kept me for several days. There were medications adjusted, procedures monitored, consultations. I was not in immediate danger, but I was being watched carefully during those days Adwoa visited. Kofi came once in 5 days. He stayed 40 minutes, stood near the door more than near the bed, and when he left, he patted my shoulder in the way you pat the shoulder of an acquaintance you feel obligated to comfort. Not the shoulder of a man whose daughter you married, not the shoulder of a man who helped fund the roof over your head. I watched him walk out and I thought, he has already decided. Whatever the future holds, he has already decided his position in it. I just don't know yet exactly what that position is. The doctors, after 8 days of monitoring and adjustment, confirmed that I was well enough to be discharged. Stable, manageable at home with the right support. The attending physician was a young woman, Dr. Afia Boateng, thorough and direct, who sat at the edge of my bed and explained clearly what I would need. Someone at home, medication adherence, rest, follow-up appointments, no stress. She said no stress with emphasis. The kind of emphasis that means she had seen what stress does to men with my condition. She wrote the discharge order herself. She told the nursing staff to prepare my paperwork. That was at 11 in the morning. By 3 in the afternoon, I was still in the bed. The nurse assigned to me that day was a young man named Ebo. Efficient, professional, with the particular combination of kindness and practicality that good nurses develop after years of watching people at their most vulnerable. He had been in several times to check on me during my stay. I trusted him. When I asked him at 3 o'clock why the discharge papers hadn't been finalized yet, I saw something happen on his face that I was not supposed to see. A flicker, something between discomfort and hesitation. He said there had been a processing delay and that he would check on it. He came back 20 minutes later. He stood at the door of my room for a moment before he came fully in, and I knew with the bone-deep knowledge that comes from 7 decades of reading human faces that what he was about to tell me was going to hurt. He came to the bedside. He kept his voice low. He said, "Mr. Osei, I need to be honest with you because I think you deserve to know." He paused. "Your son-in-law called the ward earlier. He asked us to delay your discharge." Another pause. He said he was busy. He said you could wait. I heard the words, every one of them, separately and then together. He said you could wait. I did not shout. I did not cry. I did not do any of the things a man might reasonably do upon hearing that the person responsible for taking him home had called ahead, not to ask about his condition, not to give an updated arrival time, not to send someone in his place, but to instruct medical staff to delay a sick man's departure because inconvenience was involved. I lay there, and I felt something happen inside me that was quieter and more permanent than anger. It was the feeling of a door closing. The kind of door that, once closed, cannot be opened from the inside. I thanked Ebo for telling me. He nodded once, the nod of a man who had done the uncomfortable right thing, and he left me alone. I looked at the ceiling, at those same water-stained ceiling tiles that had been my companions for 8 days, and I thought about every sacrifice I had made, every transfer I had approved, every wedding expense I had covered, every Sunday phone call that had been slowly replaced by silence, every meal eaten at the wrong time, every television program I had not watched, every moment I had swallowed my dignity because I truly believed that I was in the home of people who loved me. He said you could wait, as though I were cargo. As though 71 years of living, 34 years of working, 8 years of widowhood, a heart that was failing and a body that had already given its best decades to the people it loved. as though all of that could be parked in a hospital corridor until someone found a free slot in their schedule. The hours passed. 4 o'clock. 5. The ward shifted. Dinner was brought and I could not eat it. My phone was in my hand and it was silent. I looked at Adwoa's name in my contacts and I could not press it. Because what would I say? Your husband told the nurse to delay my discharge. Say it. Say it out loud, Adwoa, and decide what it means to you. I was afraid of what her silence on the other end of that call would confirm, so I put the phone down, and I lay there in the accumulating dark. 6 o'clock. The light outside the high window changed from afternoon to evening to the particular gray that is not quite either. Other patients in the ward received visitors. Voices, footsteps, the unwrapping of food brought from outside. Life moving around me like a river moving around a stone. I thought about Abina. I thought about what she would have said if she could see this. I thought about whether she could see it, whether somewhere in whatever exists after this world, she was watching her husband lie forgotten in a hospital bed because the man her daughter married had decided that I was not worth the inconvenience of a drive. I thought about whether I had failed her. Whether I had been wrong to trust. Whether the quiet that I had chosen, the patient, dignified, non-confrontational quiet, had been interpreted not as grace but as permission. 7 o'clock. The ward was darker now. I had stopped watching the door. It is a particular kind of grief, stopping watching the door, because it means you have moved from waiting for someone to arriving at the knowledge that no one is coming. I had arrived there, and the knowledge settled into me like cold water. And then I heard footsteps, different from the nurses, not brisk and purposeful. These were slower, measured, deliberate. The footsteps of someone who was not in a hurry because they did not need to be. The door opened, and in walked my nephew, Quabner Os. Quabner is the son of my younger brother, who passed away 4 years ago. He is 43 years old. He spent 21 years in the military, retired as a senior officer, and now runs a security consulting firm that, as I would come to understand that night, was more significant than I had previously known. He is not a large man, medium height, lean, but there is something in the way he carries himself that makes rooms feel smaller when he enters them. Not because he takes up space, because he knows exactly where he stands in every space he occupies. I had not seen him in 8 months. We were close in the way that certain family members are close, not through constant contact, but through the kind of understanding that survives long silences. When his father died, it was my shoulder he stood near at the funeral. That is the kind of close I mean. He stood in the doorway of my hospital room and looked at me, really looked. The assessing look of a man trained to understand situations quickly. And then he came in, pulled the chair close, and sat down without any of the performative cheerfulness that people often bring into hospital rooms. Uncle, he said. Quabner, I said. He looked at the untouched dinner tray, at the discharge papers still unsigned on the bedside table, at the phone in my hand with no notifications. He said, how long have you been cleared to leave? I told him, he said. And where is Kofi? I told him what Ebo had told me. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences of that day. The other silences had been empty. This one was full of something cold and precise and gathering itself. Quabner said nothing for almost 2 full minutes. Sat with his hands loosely clasped, and he looked at a point somewhere beyond the wall, and he was, I could tell, I have known him since he was a child. He was not angry in the way that makes people loud. He was angry in the way that makes people effective. Then he stood up. He said, I need to make a call, Uncle. He said it quietly, informatively, not asking permission but showing me the respect of letting me know. He said, I'll be right outside. He stepped out into the corridor. I could see him through the small window in the door. He was standing with his back to the wall, phone to his ear, not packing, not gesturing, still as architecture. He spoke for perhaps 4 minutes. I could not hear what he said. I could see his expression, and it was the expression of a man explaining a situation to someone who has the authority to address it. He came back in. He said, your paperwork will be done within the hour. I'll take you home tonight. Then he sat back down and he talked to me about his work, about his children, about the small unimportant things that are actually the most important things in conversations with people who love you. And he did not explain the phone call or who was on the other end of it. And I, who had been a stone in a river all day, felt something give way in me, not spectacularly, not with tears or speeches, just quietly, the way a fist unclenches when the thing it was holding is finally safe. At some point during those hours in the hospital, in the parts I was not aware of, because I was managing my own interior weather, something had been moving. Information had been arriving at destinations. Questions had been asked to which answers were, It turned out very uncomfortable. I did not know this yet. I only knew that Quabner had made a call, and the call had lasted 4 minutes, and by the time the ward had gone fully quiet for the night, my discharge paperwork had been completed with an apology from the nursing administrator that I did not entirely understand but accepted graciously. Quabner drove me home. Not to Kofi and Adwoa's house, he took me to his own home, where his wife, a quiet and capable woman named Efua, had already prepared a room without being asked. That is the kind of man Quabner is. That is the kind of family he has built. You understand a man better when you see what he has built. I slept. The first real sleep in 8 days, possibly more. The sleep of a man who is still in pain but is no longer alone in it. I woke at 5:47 in the morning. The room was grey with early light. Birds somewhere outside. My phone was on the nightstand. I reached for it. 10 missed calls. That was the first thing I saw. I blinked, checked the time. Looked again, 10 missed calls, all from the same number. Kofi's number. I put the phone down and lay back and looked at the ceiling, a different ceiling now, a clean one, in a room where I was wanted, and I thought about the number 10 and what it meant for a man who 16 hours ago had been too busy to drive 20 minutes to collect a sick 71-year-old man from a hospital. I picked the phone up again, 23 missed calls. The number had changed while I was looking at the ceiling. I watched it over the next 40 minutes, lying in that bed in Quabner's house in the early morning. I watched the number climb, 23, 31, 47. It went up in clusters, the way a fever goes up, not steadily but in waves, suggesting someone calling, waiting, calling again, realizing the call wasn't being answered, calling again in the accelerating panic of a man watching the consequences of his own choices arrive faster than he had anticipated. By the time I heard Efua moving in the kitchen and smelled the tea she was making, the number was 78. By the time Quabner knocked on my door and came in to check on me, it was 94. By the time I sat down at the table and ate the first real meal I had eaten in over a day, the number was 112. 112 missed calls from a man who had been too busy. I sat with my tea and I thought about that number for a long time. I thought about the architecture of it, what it told me about what Kofi now knew, what he was afraid of, what the phone call Quabner had made the night before had set in motion. 112 calls is not concern. 112 calls is not someone checking to see if you are safe. 112 calls is panic. It is the frantic activity of a man who has realized, too late, that he has made a very serious miscalculation. Quabner came and sat across from me. He wrapped his hands around his own cup, and he looked at me with the steady look of a man who knows things. I asked him who he had called. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I called 3 people, Uncle. I called a colleague of mine who works in healthcare administration compliance. I called a lawyer who is also a family friend, you don't know him. And I called someone who knew Kofi professionally." He paused. The first call was about what happened at that hospital. A medical facility cannot legally delay discharge at the request of a non-medical third party. That is not procedure, that is interference. The paperwork that was done last night was the beginning of a formal record. He paused again. The second call was about your living situation, your financial contributions to that house, the question of your rights as a dependent family member under specific provisions. He looked at me directly. And the third call, that was about something else I found out in the last few months, something I was waiting for the right moment to address. Last night seemed like the right moment. He did not tell me what the third call was about. Not then. He would tell me later. I will tell you later too, because some things need to be understood in the right order. What I knew in that moment was this: Kofi had built his confidence on a foundation he had not checked for cracks. He had treated a quiet man as a helpless one. He had made the oldest and most costly mistake that arrogant people make. He had looked at patients and seen weakness. He had looked at a man who swallowed things and assumed those things were gone. They were not gone. They were accumulating. And now someone with the knowledge and the connections to make them consequential had been shown the ledger. My phone rang at 8:14 that morning. Not Kofi's number. Adwoa. I stared at her name for 3 rings. The name I had watched grow, from the child's scrawl in a birthday card to a woman's signature on legal documents, and I felt the full complexity of what it meant to love someone who had let you down without, perhaps, fully understanding what they were letting go. I answered, "Papa." Her voice was different. The word came out compressed, like it was carrying too much weight. "Papa, where are you?" "Kofi said he's been calling all morning. He said you didn't come home last night. We didn't know." I let her finish. I had learned over the last year to let things finish before responding. Then I said, I'm at Quabena's house at Woa, I'm safe. Silence. Papa, I didn't know that Kofi had. She stopped. Then quietly, I didn't know what he told them at the hospital. Didn't you? I said, not accusingly, genuinely. Because I needed to know. I needed to understand whether my daughter had been complicit or simply absent, whether she had known and said nothing, or whether Kofi had taken his actions without her knowledge. Because these are two different categories of failing, and they require two different responses. The silence on her end told me something. It was not the silence of someone who knew and was ashamed. It was the silence of someone who was assembling information. Who was, perhaps for the first time, seeing the full shape of something she had only seen parts of. She said, I'm coming to Quabena's. I said, not harshly, not yet. There are things that need to settle first. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk. Another silence. Then, Papa, I'm sorry. I said, I know you are at Woa, I believe that. I said it and I meant it. But being sorry isn't the same as understanding what happened, and I need you to understand it fully before we talk. So give me time. I ended the call. Kofi called 4 more times that morning before noon. I did not answer any of them. I need to tell you about the third call now. The one Quabena had made to someone who knew Kofi professionally. Quabena told me over lunch. He told me carefully, the way careful people share serious information, with precision, without drama, making sure I was hearing all the parts in the right order. Kofi worked in logistics management, a senior position at a company that handled procurement and distribution contracts, some of them government adjacent. In the past year, Quabena had heard something through a mutual contact, not a rumor exactly, more like a shape in the distance that warranted watching, something about the handling of certain funds, discrepancies in procurement records, a pattern that looked, to people who understood such patterns, like something that needed explaining. Quabena had not acted on it. It was not his place to act on it. He had held it the way careful men hold things, not using it, but not discarding it. The person he called that morning was a former colleague now in a senior compliance role at a firm that had professional overlap with Kofi's employer. The call was not an accusation. It was, as Quabena put it, a sharing of information that a responsible person in that position would be obligated to act on through proper channels. Within hours, inquiries had been initiated. Internal, then, as those inquiries found what they found, external. By the time Kofi was making his 50th desperate call to my silent phone, he was also receiving calls from his own employer's compliance office. By the time the number reached 100, he was dealing with something considerably larger than a family dispute. He had built his castle on ground he thought was secret, and someone had walked through it with a light. He appeared at Quabena's house on the second day, not called, appeared. Knocked on the door with the energy of a man who still believed that physical presence could override the consequences of his choices. Quabena answered the door. I heard the exchange from the sitting room. I did not move from my chair. Quabena said he would ask if I was available. He came in, looked at me and said, your son-in-law is at the door, your decision. I thought about it. Then I said, let him in. Kofi came into the sitting room. He was, and this is important, this is something I want you to see clearly. He was not the man who had stood at that hospital door for 40 minutes and then left. He was not the man who had called ahead to delay a discharge. He was not composed. He was not in control. He was a man whose scaffolding had come down overnight and who was standing in the rubble trying to remember what he looked like before it fell. He sat down across from me without being invited to. Old habit. Even now, he could not quite bring himself to wait for permission. He started talking. I let him talk for a while. He talked about stress, about work pressure, about misunderstandings, about how he had never intended for things to go so far, about how he knew he had made mistakes. He said the word sorry 4 times in the first 2 minutes, and each time he said it, it meant slightly less than the time before. Then he stopped talking because he realized I had not said anything. I looked at him for a long moment, then I said, why didn't you come for me? He started to answer. I said, not an explanation. I'm asking you a question that deserves a direct answer. You knew I had been cleared to leave. You called that hospital and told them to delay my discharge. So I am asking you, why didn't you come for me? He said something about a meeting, about commitments, about how he had intended to come later and it had gotten away from him. The words were the words of a man who had prepared a version of events and was now delivering it to an audience who already knew the original. I let him finish. Then I said, you told the nurse I could wait. You said those exact words. He looked down. I waited, I said. I waited in that bed for hours, after 8 days of illness, after a cardiac event. I waited because you decided that your schedule was more important than your dignity and mine. I paused. I gave you my daughter's hand. I helped pay for your home. I sat in your living room for a year watching you slowly make me irrelevant in my own family's life. And I said nothing because I believed that patience was the right response to what I hoped was temporary. He was very still. It wasn't temporary, I said. Was it? He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. Now suddenly, I said, and I want you to hear how quiet I was when I said this, how completely absent of shouting, how entirely different from the rage that the situation could have justified. Now suddenly you remember I exist. He looked at me. 112 calls, I said. Not one of them to ask if I was safe. All of them for your own reasons. All of them about what is happening to you. I looked at him steadily. You were too busy for me, remember. So I'll ask you to understand that I am now going to be very deliberate about how much of my time and attention I make available for you. He opened his mouth. I said, I'm not finished. And something in my voice, not loudness, not anger in the way people perform anger, but the particular authority of a man who has found the flaw under his grief, made him close it again. Want you to know something? I said. I am not a man who punishes. I'm not going to work against you in ways that go beyond what is warranted. What is happening at your office is happening because the truth doesn't need my permission to arrive. I didn't create that situation. You did. And the people addressing it are doing so because they are obligated to, not because I asked them to. I paused. What I am saying to you now is this. I am still alive. I am here. I am not a problem to be managed or a body to be stored somewhere until it becomes convenient. I'm a man, your wife's father, and you will treat me accordingly or you will not be in my presence. He sat with that. I don't know what he expected me to say. Perhaps he expected begging, his begging, my forgiving, the kind of swift resolution that lets everyone return to exactly what they were before. That is what people who have never been held accountable expect. That if they show sufficient distress, the account will be zeroed. I had not zeroed the account. I said, you can leave now. And he left. Adwoa came 2 days later, without Kofi. She came alone, which told me something, and she came with the look of a woman who has been doing thinking that was long overdue. I will not reproduce every word of that conversation because some of it is too intimate for the telling, and because Adwoa is still my daughter and what passes between a father and his child in their most honest hours belongs to them. But I will tell you the essential things. She cried. Not performance crying, the real kind, the kind that doesn't care how it sounds. She told me she had seen things she had chosen not to name. She told me she had made herself busy inside her own house so she wouldn't have to act on what she was seeing. She said, I thought if I kept things calm, they would eventually be okay. I thought the smaller I made myself, the less friction there would be. And you paid for that, Papa. You paid for my cowardice. I looked at my daughter, my 71-year-old eyes looking at the face I had watched since it was minutes old, and I said, I know, because I did know, I had always known. And part of the grief of that year had been watching a kind woman shrink herself around an unkind man until she was barely recognizable as the person she'd been. I said, Adwoa, I'm not angry with you in the way that ends things. But I need you to understand that what was done to me in that hospital was not a small thing. It was not a mistake born of pressure or distraction. It was a decision. A deliberate decision by a man who had been making deliberate decisions about my worth for a long time, and who had been able to make them because no one in that house was willing to name what they were. She heard me. I could tell she heard me because she didn't try to explain or defend. She just sat with it. I said, I need to know what kind of woman you want to be going forward. Not the woman you've been in this last year. The woman you actually are. The woman your mother and I raised. She said, I want to be the woman who comes to the hospital. I reached across and held her hand. The consequences for Kofi were real and ongoing. I will not perform false mercy by pretending they weren't or that I feel nothing about them. What was found at his company found itself because it was real. The investigation proceeded the way such investigations do, without asking my feelings about the timeline. He was placed on administrative leave pending review. There were conversations about restitution. There were conversations between lawyers. The particulars are not mine to share in full because they involve others and because some of it is still in motion. What I will tell you is this: the house, our house, the house I helped fund, that house had, as Quaebner's lawyer friend discovered upon reviewing certain documents at Quaebner's request, my name on an earlier version of the purchase agreement that had not been fully resolved. This was not something I had thought about. It was not something I had raised, but it was there, and its being there meant that certain decisions Kofi had begun making about that property, decisions I had not been consulted on, Decisions that involved plans for my long-term care that did not include my consent were legally more complicated than he had understood. The words care facility were mentioned in documents Quabner showed me, documents that suggested Kofi had been in contact with a care facility about placing me there. Without my knowledge, without Adwoa's apparently, in quiet, I want you to sit with that. A man so unconcerned with my existence that he could not drive to a hospital was simultaneously making arrangements to move me somewhere permanent and contained. Not from love, not from concern, from a need to resolve a complication. I was the complication. A 71-year-old man with a failing heart who still had his name on documents that stood in the way of plans that had been made without him. When I read those documents, something completed itself in my understanding. The hospital, the delay, the dismissal, they were not random cruelties. They were part of a logic that had decided I was in the way. I was in the way after a lifetime of being in the service of others, after funding weddings and houses and cars and futures. I was in the way. I am telling you this not for pity. I have moved past the place where pity is useful. I am telling you this because I want you to understand the full shape of what was done, not so that you will rage at Kofi Mensah, who is now facing the results of his own choices without my assistance, but so that you understand what it means when I tell you what I have decided. I am still living at Quabner's house. Not as a guest, he made it very clear that I was to stop using that word. As family, his children call me grandfather. His wife has added my dietary requirements to her shopping without being asked twice. I sit on the veranda in the mornings and drink my tea and watch the birds that come to the tree at the edge of the yard, and I am, for the first time in longer than I want to admit, genuinely at peace. My heart is better. Not perfect, it will not be perfect again. The body is not that generous, but better, manageable. The cardiologist is pleased with my numbers. He said last week that whatever I changed in my life, I should keep changing. What I changed was the weight of being somewhere I was not wanted, of pretending I did not notice what I noticed, of swallowing my dignity with every meal eaten at the wrong time, of watching a man rewrite the terms of my humanity and telling myself it was temporary. That weight had been sitting on my heart for a year. Literally, I believe that now my relationship with Adwoa is being rebuilt, slowly. Without the full speed that comes from wanting things to be resolved before they are actually healed. She has made decisions about her marriage that I have not influenced and will not comment on here because they are hers to make. What I know is that she called me on Sunday last week. She called me on Sunday. The Sunday calls are back. I have one more thing to say. I want to say it carefully because I have been a quiet man all my life and I have earned the right to say it exactly as I mean it. People look at a quiet man and they tell themselves a story. The story is, this man is soft. This man will not fight back. This man has no leverage, no connections, no recourse. You can treat this man however you need to treat him in order to get what you want, and he will swallow it because that is what quiet men do. They swallow things. Kofi Mensah told that story about me. He told it to himself thoroughly enough that he made his plans around it. He moved through the year of small cruelties and the arrangements, and finally the hospital instruction, "He can wait, I'm busy," with the confidence of a man who had assessed his opponent and found him negligible. He was not wrong that I am quiet. He was catastrophically wrong about what the quiet meant. The quiet was not absence. The quiet was not a weakness. The quiet was not permission. The quiet was patience. The patience of a man who had built his whole life on foundations that were real work, real love, real sacrifice, real relationships with real people who knew his actual worth, and who understood that those foundations do not dissolve in a year of bad treatment from a man who misunderstood what he was standing next to. Quabner did not save me that night. Let me be clear about that. What Quabner did was walk through a door and look at a situation clearly and act on what he saw. The tools he used were tools built from truth, from what had actually happened, from what was actually documented, from what actually existed in records and agreements. The truth was always there. It was waiting to be used. I was always there. I was waiting for the right moment. People think being quiet means being weak. They think the man who doesn't raise his voice has nothing to raise it about. They think the one who doesn't threaten has nothing behind their patience. But sometimes, the quiet ones are simply waiting, watching the ledger fill, knowing that somewhere in the structure of the life they have honestly built, there is something solid enough to stand on when the time comes. I stood on it, and everything that was built on the assumption of my helplessness came down. If this story means something to you, if you have ever been the quiet one, the patient one, the one people counted on to absorb what they were unwilling to face, then I want you to do something. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you know a Frederick. Tell me if you are one, like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Because there are more stories where this one came from, more truths that need to be told in full, more moments of reckoning that people who have been overlooked deserve to see reflected back at them. I am Frederick Osei. I am 71 years old. I was left in a hospital bed by a man who thought I had nothing left. He was wrong, and I am still here to say so.